This is the fifth time since March that an American official has declared the Strait of Hormuz open. Not the first, the fifth. And every single time before this one, within days, shipping data has told a quieter, less triumphant story. So before I tell you what actually just happened with this latest declaration, I want you to sit with that pattern, because it's the single most important piece of context for understanding whether this time is actually different. Quick sourcing note, because a claim this contested deserves it. I'm drawing on the Washington Post's own fact check of this exact declaration. CBS News, The National, NPR, Reuters sourced shipping intelligence from the firm Capeler, and CENTCOM's own public statements, where the U.S. government's claim and the independent shipping data diverge. And they do diverge here. I'm going to show you both, because that gap is the actual story tonight, more than the declaration itself. Let's start with what just happened. On Tuesday, July 14th, President Trump posted on Truth Social that the Strait of Hormuz is open to, in his words, all ship traffic except for Iran. That statement came as European markets were falling and oil prices had just hit a one-month high. And it came alongside Trump backing away from an earlier proposal to charge ships a reimbursement fee for transiting the strait, instead placing blame for ongoing restrictions squarely on Tehran. Days later, CENTCOM reinforced the message directly, posting that the strait is open to all vessels seeking to lawfully transit it, and stating plainly that Iran does not control the waterway, despite recent strikes on commercial ships. CENTCOM added that its forces are positioned and prepared to ensure freedom of navigation remains available, and Trump followed up in a separate interview saying the strait is open for commercial traffic. Here's where I want you to stay with me, because this is where the story gets more complicated than the headline. The same week these declarations were being made, The National, an outlet covering Gulf shipping closely, reported that tanker traffic through the strait had dropped to its lowest level in 2 months. A shipowner's representative told that outlet there had been little appetite to transit inbound or outbound from the strait since the recent uptick in hostilities. And while transit rates had technically increased on paper, he described those rates as largely academic, given how little real activity was actually happening. Satellite imagery, reviewed by Reuters from July 11th, showed tankers conducting ship-to-ship oil transfers outside the strait entirely, in the Gulf of Oman, a practice that's become common throughout this war, specifically because it lets vessels move oil onto waiting ships without ever entering the strait itself. One shipping industry source went so far as to describe the situation as a managed conflict at this point, drawing a direct comparison to how Houthi rebels disrupted the separate Bab el-Mandeb Strait for nearly 2 years before that specific conflict wound down. That gap between the strait is open and shipping traffic just hit a 2-month low is exactly the pattern that's defined this entire crisis since it began. And I think walking through the full history of these declarations is the only way to actually evaluate whether this most recent one carries any more weight than the ones that came before it. Go back to early March. Barely a week into the war, a claim was already circulating that the strait remained fully open, with CENTCOM directly countering closure threats from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. That claim held for a while until Iran actually did move to restrict passage as the war escalated. By April 8th, following a 2-week ceasefire agreement, U.S. officials again declared the strait set to reopen, with then Secretary of War Pete Hegseth stating publicly that commerce would flow and global trade would move unhindered through the waterway. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said Iran agreed to the ceasefire terms specifically conditioned on attacks against Iran actually halting. 2 days after that declaration, on April 10th, reporting showed maritime traffic through the strait remained restricted despite the ceasefire, with industry estimates putting the drop at nearly 95% compared to pre-crisis levels. The ships that were moving were mostly Iranian-linked vessels, so-called dark fleet tankers operating without standard identification, or ships flying flags of countries Iran considered non-hostile, like Russia and China, routed through a narrow northern corridor along Iran's own coastline under direct IRGC monitoring, rather than through standard international shipping lanes. That's about as far from commerce flowing unhindered as a technically not closed strait can get. By late March, CBS News reported the deeper structural problem underlying all of this. Daily transits through the strait had fallen somewhere between 90 and 95% since the war began, according to the shipping intelligence firm Capeler, with hundreds of tankers effectively trapped in the Persian Gulf. Marine insurance costs in the region had skyrocketed to the point where the Trump administration directed a government agency, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, to partner with the insurance company Chubb, specifically, to backstop political risk insurance for shippers, in a program potentially covering up to $20 billion in losses. With supply effectively cut off, the international Brent crude benchmark was trading close to $113 a barrel at that point, more than 50% above pre-war levels. Then came a third round of reopening in early May. CENTCOM launched what it called an operation specifically to end Iran's blockade and reopen the waterway. And NPR's reporting from that period captured Hegseth and chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, giving what NPR described as an upbeat assessment, saying the operation's first day showed that the U.S., not Iran, controlled the strait. But even in that same briefing, according to NPR, both officials described the operation as temporary and said no additional commercial ships had actually gone through the strait since it began, even as they characterized the blockade as effectively broken. By early June, the National was reporting yet another version of the same story. Dozens of ships, reportedly somewhere between 30 and 70 vessels, had managed to cross the strait since early May, some with U.S. naval guidance and even helicopter escort, facing what the reporting described as the triple threat of Iranian sea mines, missiles, and fast attack boats along the way. Analysts were explicit that these crossings remained the exception rather than a sign of normalized traffic. One analyst at Camco Invest put it plainly, transit through the strait was extremely limited, and for it to become mainstream would require actual agreement between the U.S. and Iran, not just American military pressure. A senior analyst at the crisis group made a similarly blunt point, stating that there's no military solution to the strait and the wider war, and that Iran's claimed control of the strait remained intact, specifically because Iran wouldn't give up that leverage in negotiations for nothing. Even where American escorted transits were happening, that analyst noted, it remained unclear how much direct protection those ships actually had against Iran's fast attack craft, missiles, drones, and mines, meaning every one of those transits still carried real risk. Now, let's bring it forward to this most recent declaration in mid-July, because the pattern from March through June repeats almost exactly. The insurance industry's own reporting from just days before Trump's Truth Social post captured the actual mood among ship owners in real time. London marine insurers told reporters they'd seen fewer inquiries for Hormuz transits, and some said the cost of coverage had risen further, describing a renewed sense of caution across the industry as the U.S. and Iran traded attacks. On the Thursday just before this, visible shipping traffic through the strait had, according to that reporting, virtually ground to a halt, with several ship owners who'd recently made the crossing saying they were reconsidering doing so again, and at least one canceling a planned transit outright. There's also a wrinkle in how you even measure traffic in the strait right now, which matters for evaluating any of these open or closed claims. Some vessels have reportedly been crossing with their transponders deliberately switched off, meaning they don't show up on the standard tracking systems analysts and journalists use to assess real shipping volume. That means the true picture of activity is muddier than any single traffic count can capture. Genuinely open, normalized shipping should show up clearly and consistently across tracking systems, while what's actually happening looks more like a mix of a small number of confirmed, often escorted transits, a larger number of ships avoiding the strait entirely through ship-to-ship transfers outside it, and an unknown quantity of vessels moving through with their identifying systems deliberately obscured. Let's talk about why insurance specifically has become the real bottleneck here, because it's arguably more important than any single military statement about whether the strait is technically passable. One industry figure reported that war risk insurance premiums for the strait had risen to roughly 4,000 times their pre-crisis level at one point this spring, even for ships crossing with U.S. naval escort. Insurance isn't just a cost line item in this context. When premiums become genuinely unaffordable or coverage becomes entirely unavailable, ships simply cannot sail, regardless of what any government says about the waterway being open. That's exactly the dynamic the World Economic Forum flagged in its own analysis of this crisis. When private insurers pull back from a risk this severe, governments increasingly have to step in directly to keep any shipping moving at all, which is precisely why the Trump administration ended up standing up its own government-backed insurance program through the Development Finance Corporation, rather than simply declaring the problem solved through military statements alone. Before I get further into what this all actually means, let me clear up a few claims I've seen attached to this specific story, because a topic this back and forth tends to accumulate distortion fast. Claim 1, that this most recent declaration is somehow the first time the U.S. has claimed victory over Iran's control of the strait, making it a genuinely new milestone. It isn't. As covered above, there have been at least 5 distinct rounds of the strait is open messaging since March, each following a different military or diplomatic development, and each followed within days by reporting showing real traffic still suppressed. Treating this latest one as a unique breakthrough ignores that exact pattern. Claim 2, that Iran has essentially given up trying to restrict the strait at all, and any remaining disruption is purely a residual effect of general war zone caution rather than active Iranian action. That's not accurate either. Iran has continued laying mines, conducting missile and drone strikes on commercial vessels, and issuing warnings about routes it considers unauthorized well into July, which is a big part of why insurance costs and shipowner caution have remained elevated rather than settling down on their own over time. Claim 3. That the handful of ships crossing with U.S. naval escort proves the corridor is now fully safe and just needs wider adoption to become normal traffic again. Industry analysts have pushed back on that specific framing directly, noting that even escorted transits carry real risk from mines, missiles, and fast attack boats, and that the small number of these crossings, whether 30 or 70 vessels since early May, represents a tiny fraction of the roughly 17 to 19,000 transits the Strait handled annually before this war, according to historical shipping volume figures for the waterway. A handful of successful, heavily protected crossings is meaningfully different from a functioning, insurable commercial shipping lane. Claim 4, that the ship-to-ship transfers happening outside the Strait in the Gulf of Oman represent some kind of clever workaround that's effectively solved the blockage problem for global oil markets. It's a workaround, but a limited and inefficient one. These transfers add real-time, cost, and logistical complexity to oil shipments compared to direct transit through the Strait. And they only work at all for cargo that can tolerate the delay and additional handling. They're not a substitute for restoring the Strait's normal function as one of the most efficient choke points in global trade. It's worth understanding the naval side of this campaign in a bit more depth, because the U.S. forced the Strait open implies a specific kind of military operation. And it's worth being precise about what that operation has actually consisted of over these past several months. Since March, U.S. and allied forces have conducted a sustained campaign against Iranian naval vessels, drone launch capability, and coastal missile batteries specifically positioned to threaten shipping through the Strait. That's included the assassination of Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval officer who had been overseeing the blockade effort directly, removing the specific commander responsible for coordinating Iran's Strait operations, not just degrading equipment. It's included a formal naval blockade imposed by the U.S. in mid-April after diplomatic talks in Islamabad broke down. It's included direct orders from President Trump for the Navy to destroy any Iranian vessels caught laying mines. And it's included the dedicated escort operation launched in early May specifically to physically shepherd commercial vessels through the waterway. Layered together, that's a genuinely extensive, sustained military effort, and it has degraded Iran's naval and coastal strike capability in real, documented ways across this entire period. What it hasn't done, based on the shipping and insurance data covered throughout this video, is restore the kind of stable, low-risk, high-volume shipping environment that existed before the war, which is really the more meaningful test of whether the Strait has actually been forced open in the way most people would understand that phrase. The broader economic ripple effects here are worth spelling out in more detail too, because the Strait's importance isn't an abstract talking point. It shows up directly in energy prices that affect essentially the entire global economy. Brent crude traded near $113 a barrel back in late March, more than 50% above pre-war levels, largely as a direct result of the disruption to Hormuz traffic. Oil prices have continued reacting sharply to each new escalation throughout this crisis, including the jump to a one-month high that coincided with this most recent round of Trump's statements and the market's skepticism about whether they reflected genuine normalization. That kind of price volatility ripples through the cost of everything from gasoline to shipping-dependent consumer goods worldwide, which is exactly why global markets have learned over the course of this crisis to treat each new Strait-is-open announcement with real caution rather than immediate relief. Market reactions to this most recent declaration were notably muted compared to how markets might have responded to a credible, verified reopening earlier in the war, which is itself a signal of how much credibility these repeated announcements have lost over time among the people whose job it is to price this risk accurately. And the U.S. has genuinely forced it open? I think the fair reading, based on this entire pattern from March through July, is that both things are partially true, and neither is fully true. Iran has clearly lost the ability to enforce a complete, unilateral closure of the Strait the way it may have hoped to early in this war. The sustained American military campaign, including the naval blockade, repeated strikes on Iranian naval vessels and coastal missile sites, and the assassination of the commander overseeing Iran's blockade effort, has genuinely degraded Iran's capacity to shut the waterway down entirely. At the same time, the U.S. forced it open overstates what's actually happened on the water. What's actually been forced open is a narrow, heavily escorted, still dangerous corridor carrying a small fraction of pre-war traffic, not the kind of full, insurable, normalized commercial shipping lane that open implies to most people hearing that word. Every one of the 5 separate reopening declarations across this war, from March through this most recent one, has been followed within days by reporting showing traffic still running at some fraction of normal, insurance still elevated or unavailable, and continued real risk for any ship that actually attempts the crossing. It's worth drawing out the comparison to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait crisis a bit further, because one shipping official directly invoked it, and the parallel is instructive for thinking about how long a situation like this can realistically drag on. Houthi rebels operating out of Yemen disrupted shipping through that separate choke point, connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, for close to 2 years before a ceasefire finally brought that specific crisis to an end in 2026. During that entire stretch, similar patterns played out. Periodic claims that the situation was improving or that safe passage had been restored, followed by renewed attacks that pushed shipping companies back into caution, extended rerouting around the southern tip of Africa for vessels avoiding the Red Sea entirely, and sustained elevated insurance costs for the ships that continued attempting the shorter route. If the Strait of Hormuz crisis follows anything like that same trajectory, the pattern of repeated premature resolution announcements, followed by renewed disruption that's characterized this crisis since March, could plausibly continue for a considerable stretch longer, rather than resolving cleanly through any single military operation or diplomatic statement. There's also a sanctions evasion angle woven through this entire story that's worth naming directly, because it complicates the simple picture of traffic is either flowing or it isn't. The Dark Fleet vessels mentioned earlier, ships operating with transponders switched off or flying flags of convenience specifically to obscure their ownership and cargo, aren't a new phenomenon invented by this war. They're the same basic infrastructure that's developed over years of sanctions evasion by Iran, Russia, and other sanctioned oil producers, seeking to move crude to buyers without going through internationally scrutinized, fully insured, transparent shipping channels. This war has essentially supercharged the use of that existing dark fleet infrastructure, because it's one of the few remaining ways to move any oil through or around the strait without exposing a vessel and its crew to the kind of war risk insurance premiums that legitimate, transparent shipping companies simply can't absorb. That means a meaningful share of whatever traffic is actually moving through or around the strait right now likely isn't showing up in official reopening claims at all, precisely because it's designed to stay off the radar of the same authorities making those claims. I think it's also worth being honest about how this pattern reflects on trust in wartime government statements more broadly, not just in this specific conflict. Every government fighting an active war has a strong incentive to describe battlefield and strategic progress in the most favorable light available, and that's not unique to the U.S., or to this particular administration. It's a near universal feature of how governments communicate during active conflicts throughout history. The responsible response to that reality isn't cynicism that assumes every official statement is false, but rather exactly the kind of pattern tracking I've tried to walk through in this video, comparing each new claim against independent verifiable data points like shipping volumes, insurance rates, and satellite tracking, rather than accepting or rejecting any single statement purely based on which government made it, or how it's phrased. Because I think it explains the pattern better than assuming either side is simply lying. Declaring the strait open serves an immediate political and market purpose, regardless of the actual on-the-water situation. It's meant to calm oil markets, reassure allies, and project that the military campaign is succeeding. And in a war this expensive and this politically fraught domestically, that kind of reassurance carries real value, independent of whether it's fully accurate at the moment it's made. That doesn't mean the declarations are dishonest exactly. CENTCOM's claim that the strait is open to vessels seeking to lawfully transit, it is narrower and more defensible than it might first appear, since it's really describing the legal and military status of the waterway rather than claiming normal commercial volume has actually returned. But that's a meaningfully narrower claim than what most viewers hear when a headline says the strait has been forced open. And I think that gap between the technical claim and the popular interpretation of it is worth naming directly every single time one of these declarations comes out. I think the most honest single-sentence summary of where things actually stand is this. Iran can no longer fully close the strait by force without paying an enormous and escalating military cost, but the U.S. also hasn't restored the kind of stable, insurable, high-volume shipping lane that existed before this war began, and nothing in the pattern from March through July suggests that gap is closing quickly. Both governments have strong incentives to describe this same underlying messy reality in the most favorable terms available to them, and I'd encourage you to treat any future strait is open announcement from either side with the same scrutiny I've applied to this one. Check the shipping data and insurance rates a few days later, not just the statement itself, because that's where the real answer has consistently shown up throughout this entire crisis. I also want to acknowledge directly what would actually change my assessment here, because I think it's fair to lay out what evidence would genuinely indicate this time is different. If, in the coming days, Capital or comparable shipping intelligence firms report transit volumes climbing back meaningfully toward pre-war levels, if war risk insurance premiums start declining rather than holding near their crisis peaks, and if that pattern holds for more than just a brief window before the next round of hostilities, that would be a real, substantive signal that this declaration carries more weight than the four that came before it. Absent that kind of independently verifiable data, I think the responsible position is exactly the one I've taken throughout this video. acknowledging the real military degradation of Iran's blockade capability, while remaining skeptical of the specific claim that the strait has been meaningfully restored to normal function, because that specific, narrower claim simply hasn't held up across 5 separate attempts to make it since this war began in February. It's worth putting a final point on just how much the surrounding region depends on this specific waterway functioning normally, because it's not only a US-Iran issue playing out at a distance from everyone else. Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, rely on the strait as their primary route for exporting the oil and gas that underpin their entire economies, meaning every week this crisis drags on. Without genuine normalization, represents a direct economic cost to American allies in the region, not just an abstract geopolitical talking point. That's part of why several Gulf governments have pushed through diplomatic channels for a durable resolution rather than the current pattern of temporary military operations and premature reopening announcements. Their own economic stability is directly tied to whether this waterway actually returns to normal function, in a way that neither Washington nor Tehran bears in quite the same direct, immediate form. It's also worth remembering, as this story continues to develop, that the underlying dispute driving all of this, the broader war between the U.S. Israel and Iran, remains fundamentally unresolved. The crisis group analyst quoted earlier made a point that's worth repeating as a closing thought. There's no purely military solution to the strait's status, separate from the wider war itself. Iran has consistently treated its ability to threaten the waterway as one of its few remaining sources of leverage in any eventual negotiation, and that calculus doesn't obviously change just because the U.S. has degraded some of Iran's naval hardware or issued another public statement about the strait's status. As long as the broader war continues without a durable settlement, I'd expect this exact same cycle, a declaration of victory followed within days by shipping and insurance data telling a more complicated story, to keep repeating, regardless of which specific military operation or diplomatic development prompts the next announcement. If you want the confirmed version of a story that keeps generating premature victory declarations, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I plan to keep checking each new strait is open claim against the actual shipping and insurance data the way I did tonight, rather than taking any single announcement at face value. And drop a comment telling me what you want covered next. A closer look at how the ship-to-ship transfer workaround outside the strait actually functions, or a deeper dive into how the government-backed insurance program is holding up as this crisis continues into its 5th month. I read every comment, and it shapes what gets covered next.